So this class is on the theoretical basis of a warm-up. We'll cover 3 key topics throughout this class. Firstly, we'll start with the theoretical background of what a warm-up is and the physiological and cognitive effects that come from undertaking a warm-up. The second part, we'll look at the performance benefits as related to physical capacities and football performance that come from a warm-up, and also the changing injury risk that we get from engaging in warm-ups. The third section will then look at the theoretical aspects of the application, design, and other considerations involved in warming up. So this class is less about the specifics of the exercises to do and more an understanding of the foundations and theory as to why and what to perform that you would then use to apply in your warm-ups. So let's start with what is a warm-up. So a warm-up is a sequence of exercises and activities that prepares an athlete to be physiologically, cognitively, emotionally and mentally prepared for the ensuing exercise bout. Okay? So ideally, the undertaking of a warm-up will leave the athlete in a state where they are in optimal readiness to perform the ensuing exercise bout, whatever that is. A one-off jump, a one-off lift, a prolonged effort, or a long duration event, or some mixture. So the idea of a warm-up is to specifically prepare an athlete to be holistically prepared to undertake an optimal exercise bout after that. In this case, it's how you get an athlete ready for skill, physical, emotional, cognitive task in a football pitch or in a football environment. Why is it important? Well, these are common themes and a lot of them are intuitive to most practitioners. Obviously, a warm-up should provide faster muscle contraction and faster rate of force development for any outcome. It should improve strength and power. It should improve post-activation and potentiation, a topic that we'll talk about, or theoretically improve. It should lower the resistance for muscle contraction, increase blood flow, increase metabolic efficiency, faster reaction time and decision-making time, and promote a state of psychological preparedness and emotional wellness to actually engage in optimal performance. So in short, the warm-up ideally promotes this readiness to perform for whatever the next event is. Let's start off by exploring some of the physiological benefits that come from a warm-up. And we'll start with the more cardiovascular aerobic system. So one of the things of a warm-up is that it increases the availability of oxygen in the blood to be used by the muscle. So we can see here in the example of a non-warm-up followed by a warm-up state, whereby the resting VO2 or the baseline VO2, so the oxygen consumption, is elevated. So one of the primary outcomes from a warm-up is to increase the oxygen delivery to a muscle for the start of the exercise bout, the match, the training, or any other performance. So this is not necessarily from a faster kinetics or a faster uptake, but a greater availability of oxygen because the baseline oxygen consumption has been increased. It also theoretically reduces the reliance on the anaerobic energy systems in that moment. So one of the big things about a warm-up is that it promotes a greater availability of oxygen to the muscles prior to the exercise bout. That availability is also correlated or associated with a faster dissociation. So the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, it's a mouthful, but what that represents is essentially the relationship between the hemoglobin binding with oxygen and the partial pressure of oxygen. So not the concentration, but the availability of oxygen. Now this is a temperature-dependent relationship, and it's not quite curvilinear, but as you increase the partial pressure, you increase the unloading of the oxygen from the hemoglobin to allow it to go into the muscle. As the temperature increases, this shifts as well. So as you get increased body temperature, you can shift the faster unloading of oxygen into the muscle. So when you combine a warm-up effects with promoting more blood flow and more oxygen in the blood and more blood to the muscle, with a faster unloading of oxygen into the muscle, you get potential benefits for performance because there's more oxygen available in the muscle. So a key part of a warm-up is to promote this faster unloading of oxygen from the hemoglobin. But separately, we also know that as the temperature increases, so as the temperature increases in a muscle, the availability of anaerobic energy systems increases. So that temperature increases the anaerobic enzymes that help break down carbohydrates to produce fast sources of ATP for the muscle to use. So not only do you have this greater VO2, so a warm-up promotes a higher oxygen consumption, it promotes also higher oxygen availability, it promotes a faster unloading, but also primes the muscle to use anaerobic sources faster, even though you have a higher amount of oxygen there, and so you don't necessarily need to use those anaerobic sources. So a warm-up creates both temperature and cardiovascular changes that put the muscle, if not the whole body, in a better state to produce more work faster in an ensuing bout of exercise, i.e. your performance. From a cardiovascular perspective, we'll move back a bit. So a warm-up creates greater muscle recruitment. Not necessarily high intensity, although we'll talk about intensity later, but a greater volume of muscle recruitment. That greater volume of muscle recruitment causes an increase in cardiovascular responses. So we see cardiac output increase. Now, cardiac output is how much blood the heart is pumping out each minute. That increase in cardiac output, because of the muscle contraction to provide more blood, comes from increasing in heart rate and increase in stroke volume. So you get this combined effect that prior warm-up increases muscle recruitment at moderate to higher intensity, increases cardiac output, increases heart rate, increases stroke volume. Adds to that the unloading of muscle oxygenation or unloading of oxyhemoglobin into the muscle, and you get a better state. In order for that cardiovascular response to be present, we have peripheral vasodilation. So what this means is the arteries that flood the muscle and the capillaries that flood the muscle open up to allow greater blood flow, to allow greater blood supply, to allow greater oxygen presence for the muscle. Combine that with the oxyhemoglobin dissociation, i.e. the removal of oxygen from the blood into the muscle, and again you get a better physiological state following a warm-up for the ensuing exercise bout, be it speed, power, endurance, whatever the case is. So there's some cardiovascular responses to a warm-up that promote a more optimal or better physiological state to then engage in following up exercise. There's also temperature-dependent methods or mechanisms that improve performance following a warm-up. So we know that as muscle recruitment occurs and as the muscles contract during a warm-up or any exercise, one of the byproducts is heat. That heat release increases both muscle temperature and also body temperature. So that muscle temperature and body temperature increases have physiological consequences and neuromuscular consequences that improve muscle contraction and muscle performance, if not whole body performance. So a key part of the warm-up is not just to provide increased cardiovascular functioning, but to increase the core temperature and also the muscle temperature to provide better outcomes for muscle contraction. I'll explore a few of those now. So within the muscle, we know that when the fibers contract, when your actin and myosin contract, okay, one of the products is not just mechanical movement, but a byproduct is heat. That heat heats up the surrounding environment within that muscle, so the fluid that surrounds the muscle. And as that fluid gets hotter and hotter, the viscosity decreases. So we know that as the temperature increases, the resistance to the contraction based on the fluid around it reduces. And this is a beneficial outcome for ensuing muscle contraction, is that the fluid around it, where the muscle has to operate, has less resistance against the actual contraction. So it's improving the efficiency and the rate of power that you can improve. And as we can see from the figure here, that's an inverse relationship, is that the higher temperature, the lower the viscosity. So a warm-up that increases muscle temperature to a certain level, decreases the viscosity, improves the resistance the muscle has to contract against within its own environment, is then going to ensure that you have better rate of force development, better force outcomes, and less internal restriction to promote better muscle contraction. And in turn, hopefully improve physical performance from a whole body perspective as well. So a key part of a warm-up is to increase muscle temperature. Aligned with that is that we also know that heating of a muscle or cooling of a muscle has direct effects on its neuromuscular properties. So its contraction ability, the force it can produce, the rate it can produce, and the overall outcome at a muscle level. So this figure nicely illustrates schematically a few of those relationships. You can see that as a muscle temperature increases, the rate of force development will increase until it plateaus up around about that 40 degrees. So normally resting temperatures are in the 36, 37 degree range. So if you increase muscle temperature, you're certainly going to increase the rate of force development. we also can see that voluntary force increases as muscle temperatures increase. They do plateau, so above and beyond 40 degrees Celsius, we're not going to get any more benefits. And we know conversely that high core body temperatures will promote fatigue. So there's a range in which to promote muscle temperature increases, but control core body temperature increases to get optimal whole body outcomes. And that's the real art and science of a warm-up, is to promote that environment. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But certainly a key message to take away here is that increasing muscle temperature from resting will optimise rate of force development, will increase peak power and improve the efficiency of a muscle contraction compared to cooler temperatures. And that's a key point of a warm-up, is to increase muscle temperature. And we also know that neural potentiation and the muscle force characteristics are better with warmer temperatures. Even when we passively heat a muscle, we will get increased force outcomes following passive heating. So by actively heating through warm-up, we get a range of other cardiovascular benefits, but we also increase muscle temperature, we optimise force outcome, and optimise the velocity and the rate of muscle contractions. And another example that here is shown, whereby the rate and the peak power outcomes that are imposed from hotter or increased muscle temperatures are better. Isometric force contraction doesn't change based on temperature. So one of those nuances of the isometric contraction process. So peak torque won't change, but the rate of force development and the rate to peak force development is improved with increased muscle temperature. So again, relating the contractile function of higher muscle temperatures with greater cardiovascular loads to promote more oxygen availability and primed anaerobic source use is the beautiful little nexus that we want to try and provide through a warm-up. The other potential benefit of a warm-up is the improvement in post-activation potentiation, or PAP. So post-activation potentiation is a byproduct that we notice when the muscle's undergone some contraction. It's then primed neurally or physically, mechanically, to produce more force for the same recruitment. Okay, so it optimizes. So undergoing a prior contraction promotes an increased force in the next contraction. So it's a nice concept that we see in a range of sports and a range of exercise intensities. And it's certainly something to consider when designing your warm-up, is how you can improve post-activation potentiation. Now that post-activation potentiation relies on two things. One, the muscle contraction promotes an optimization of force, which you can see at the top with the peak PAP. Conversely to that is that you also have an increase in fatigue from that contraction. So your performance benefits from PAP come from these windows of where the rate of force development is high, but the fatigue status still hasn't become exacerbated. And there's two key windows where PAP is primed. One is immediately post the contraction, where the contractile elements are still ready and the neural priming is there, but the fatigue is still developing. And the second is a second window within 7 to 10 minutes following that contraction. So again, while this is a nice theory of PAP, as we'll see later, the actual physical, logistical demands of how you undertake a warm-up, particularly in a competition setting, may make some of this redundant. But being aware that increasing muscle temperature promotes better neuromuscular contraction outcomes, and that post-activation potentiation may improve force outcomes in the short term, are certainly key requirements for what you consider when designing your warm-up. We also know that post-activation potentiation depends on the type of athlete and the space, time and engagement in the activity that you undertake. So we can see here that in untrained athletes with shorter rest periods, PAP is optimised. When you move into trained athletes, that PAP is slower and later. But when you move into highly trained athletes, the effects of PAP are much less. And this is based on a meta-analysis of a range of studies. Now, not all those studies have strength and logistical appropriateness and are well conducted, but certainly we see this picture emerging that the effectiveness of a PAP is going to be dependent upon your time zone, i.e. immediately or within 10 minutes, and the extent of that effect is going to be dependent on how well trained your athletes are. So in a football environment, the notion of a PAP may actually be redundant because of the time frame of when you actually get to warm up versus when you compete or train, as well as the highly trained status may limit the effect of that PAP on ensuring exercise intensity. But certainly part of your warm-up is to heat the muscle to improve the contractile elements and potentially get this increased neural potentiation from that warm-up as an outcome as well. So a summary of the physiological benefits of a warm-up. Ideally, the warm-up increases body temperature and muscle temperature. And as we'll see later, increases are good, but excessive increases may actually relate to increased fatigue. Blood vessel vasodilation from the increased blood flow is also critical to deliver that oxygen, or to increase oxygen delivery to a working muscle. That increased oxygen delivery comes from an increased cardiac output, which comes from the increased heart rate and stroke volume. Okay? The higher cardiac output also promotes larger volumes of oxygen to be present, and the increase in temperature promotes the unloading of that oxygen into the muscle. So the actual delivery to the muscle is improved. There's a better metabolic substrate availability. Anaerobic systems are primed, aerobic systems are greater, which then provides a reduced reliance on anaerobic energy systems at the start of any exercise bout. And we also potentially get increased neural transmission and potentiation of the muscle. Certainly the heat characteristics or the muscle temperature promotes better force and rate of power development outcomes than a cooler muscle. And so a warm-up that promotes that is definitely going to have advantages. Whether the actual neural transmission is increased is a vexed and complex topic. Theoretically and intuitively it will, but the evidence for that is still not as strong. So I guess these physiological benefits are the real drivers that most practitioners and most academics understand for why to do a warm-up. And the evidence is pretty strong and pretty evident across a range of sports and athletic populations that a prior warm-up promotes this optimal physiological state, which promotes better outcomes for performance, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the physiological components are only one aspect of what a warm-up could provide. Another part is the psychological benefits, and a lot of players and coaches also would consider this important. Now, intuitively, doing prior exercise would promote a better psychological state, but the actual evidence for the effectiveness of a warm-up to do that is a lot less explicit and a lot less stronger than the physiological data, and hence most people rely on the physiological data to justify the need for a warm-up. From a psychological perspective, we know that this inverted U hypothesis of under-arousal versus over-arousal both create poorer physical performance or cognitive performance, and hence somewhere in the middle of this there's an optimal performance area with a moderate to higher arousal level. And so one of the aspects of a warm-up is to try and create this psychological state that optimises arousal. Now, appreciating that arousal can come from a range of areas and a range of influences. You know, what drives motivation? Often it's not the warm-up. In fact, the warm-up can create this dread in athletes of, oh, do I have to go through this again? So whilst it may promote the physiological state, it actually may subdue or reduce the cognitive and the arousal and psychological state. So when you translate the theory into the practice, how you maintain those two is often the art of a well-developed warm-up. But certainly the prior activity before the exercise bout, match or training or testing, should promote a heightened psychological state. Arousal, motivation, concentration, attention and focus. And this is where the mixture of what the activities are, how they're conducted, when they're conducted, that we'll talk about later and others will talk about in more detail, are critical components of not just increasing cardiovascular and not just increasing temperature, but also creating a nice psychological state. The other thing athletes like about the warm-up from a psychological perspective is that it creates environmental familiarity. What's the ball like? What's the grass like? What's the light like? What's the stadium like? What's the temperature like? That engagement in the environment to give some sort of familiarity and confidence is still pretty important. And it may have nothing to do with temperature dependent or cardiovascular dependent or energy system models of warm-up, but it may be about how you feel comfortable in that environment. The other thing, and some old data here that's nice to remember, particularly when you're structuring a warm-up, is that there's some interesting evidence from a qualitative perspective that the better the athlete, the more refined their pre-performance routines are. Okay? So what they do, how they structure it, are very intimate and very intricate to particular athletes. And the better the athlete, sometimes the better designed their pre-performance routines are. So by physically imposing a warm-up onto a high-performance athlete, whether you actually detract from that or improve that is a consideration, particularly in a football context where you have a range of players doing a range of activities with a range of motivational states and performance levels, and accommodating for that is where there can be some difficulty. But be aware that, and as we'll see later, high performance athletes often have a preference for how they perform. Now, whether that's optimal enough, whether you can improve that, is still an awesome debate. But be aware of the athlete's perceived need for that warm-up and what they get out of it and what they need for it, and accommodating that in your warm-up are still some critical outcomes, regardless of just the physiological improvements in the ability to perform. The final thing to consider in a warm-up is the skill, the coordination, and the task performance. Feeling the ball on the foot, sensing where the goals are, the light, the crowd, the environment. These kind of task performance elements are quite important. And the research on them is difficult logistically, and proof is not necessarily high. But we'll explore a couple of ideas. So the first one is from a golf setting, so a quite innate and intimate task performance. So in this context, golf putting as a real learned skill. This study looked at internal cues of focusing on I have to do this my way versus external cues of I need to perform this task based on the environment. Okay, I need to putt to here versus I need to feel this. They undertook a series of learning and then testing. And what they found was that when the skills that you undertook were engaged with an external focus, you actually performed them better for task testing when you had additional pressure from an external environment. So focusing on performance of the task from external cues as opposed to internal cues was stronger for the maintenance of that task performance, albeit that it was golf putting and albeit that it was a learned. But it's a key thing to think about that the instructions that you provide, the environment that you provide to actually perform a particular skill task in the context of trying to get them physiologically ready can be important for then that skill repetition and skill performance going on. So the drills you choose, the performance of that drill, and the engagement and prior priming of that drill in the warm-up still have some consequence. So whilst conceptually it's about feeling the ball on the foot or just feeling the ball move towards the goal that athletes feel comfortable with, the actual task and the production of that task and the information you give to an athlete in that warm-up may have an effect on ensuing performance. Only small effects, but again, it's something to be aware of when you design your warm-up. Following on from that concept of priming with pre-information from a more football perspective, a nice little study here from Job Franson's group looked at primed instructions versus neutral instructions. So they showed players, semi-professional players, a large screen with images of a task performance. Okay. They primed those players with specific instructions and coaching tasks prior to performance of this actual drill with a large visual display versus just giving them neutral rules of football. So two conditions. One, specifically priming with specific skill instructions. The second, just neutral generic rules of football, which everyone knew. What they found was that they actually giving primed instructions improved the speed of the response time to particular tasks. So it wasn't across the board, it was particular tasks, but it actually decreased the accuracy. So those pre-cues can have some small effects on the speed and accuracy of decision making. So certainly when you're setting up your warm-up as a strength and conditioning or sports scientist, yes, the physiological development is critical, but also the task performance, how you structure it, the instructions you give, the environment can have an effect on the priming of that activity for the ensuing outcomes. So although it's small effects, it's something to consider. So as a summary of the warm-up activities, you should promote an optimal physiological and physical state. And I guess as most practitioners, this is the guiding rationale for a warm-up. We do the warm-up to provide this optimal physiological state, and then we hand them across to the coaches and they do their thing. But certainly not just the physiological state, but the arousal and the motivational state should be in consideration of where they'll finish their warm-up at. There should also be sufficient task specificity, because not just the feel of it, but the actual priming of the cognitive and the decision-making cues are also important, separate from the motivational and separate from the physiological state. Should also promote an appropriate exposure to the environment and also the appropriate cognitive loading. A classic line drill warm-up of just simple skills may be appropriate, but it's not really a high cognitive load. It's more for the feel. So drills that promote greater movement, greater cognitive load, greater engagement, and also hold some motivational factors in tow is really that optimal nexus of these environments for improving a warm-up. How you give instructions and what you give instructions and the stop-start nature of the warm-up also affect the physiological, the cognitive and the psychological consequences of that warm-up. So certainly being aware of, whilst an overall drill may see a given player moving at any time, but any given player also may be stationary, should be how you're mapping out your warm-up drills. So how you engage those above points depends on the training or the match context, and we'll talk about that later, because the reality of your environment is dictated by the logistics of whether it's a match, a training, and the time that you have. So how you fit that into a certain space and time is obviously the art of being a practitioner, and we'll talk about those in other classes later. But choosing your drills and having a catalogue of drills and activities that you can fit to meet those needs is pretty critical as a practitioner, and adapting them given the logistics of the environment.